So, how is women's mental health represented in video games? Modern video games are beginning to add depth to their female characterizations, but are still falling into gender biased reasonings for said characters' illnesses and their degrees of illness. Let's take a look at some important information to set the stage. There's an undeniable surge of popularity in video games as a medium of entertainment on a global scale. A Spanish study of gender representation and using a sample of 11 popular and recently released games at the time of the study found that overall there have been 3.31 billion recorded gamers, with 446 million of them coming from Europe. Staying in Spain, there are just over 20 million gamers, making it a majority of children to young adults. The gender division between sheer number of gamers is 51 to 49% in favor of men. All players average to 7.71 hours of playing video games every week, which compared to a few other nearby countries is about an hour under the average gaming per week based on the countries listed in the study. The Spanish study found that in Spain, 47.9% of young gamers have expressed criticism that video games are primarily designed for men, and 54.1% have articulated concerns about the prevalence of sexist content in games. Only 12% of next-gen video games exclusively feature a female protagonist with whom the player can identify. Another finding supports the young Spanish gamers' concern about women's representation in that 62.5% of women in games are young adults, a preferable age for most men, while the male character age range was more spread out. The sexism the young Spanish gamers were worried about is also present in the relationship between dominant and submissive or passive characteristics in male and female characters. 85.29% of dominant character positions are filled by male characters. Overall, submissive or passive characters were 37.5% female and only 21.62% male. A study for a Toronto mental health journal found that many games have elements relating to mental health and have used historical approaches to, quote, handling mental health. Quote, some games, 10%, depicted time periods reminiscent of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, referring to mental health care in historic terms, e.g., describing mental health institutions as asylums or sanatoriums. This is because of, quote, the troubling and ethnically questionable history of the treatment of mental illness provided a suitably macabre context for horror games, end quote. Quote, most of the games we reviewed, 97%, portrayed a perpetuated well-known stereotype and prejudice associated with mental illness, namely that those with mental illness, especially psychosis, are violent, scary, insane, abnormal, incapable, unlikely to get well, isolated, and fearful, end quote. Ferrari and other authors in this study found that, quote, in both past and future scenarios, 16% of games, individuals with mental illness are depicted as dangerous, in need of containment and separation from society, and requiring treatment that involves constant surveillance by doctors or authority figures, usually in asylums, end quote. Quote, in exploring the relationship between mental illness and game goals, we identified the following themes: solving/uncovering a mystery, survival, finding an escape, and restoring normalcy in approximately 65 to 70% of the games, end quote. Quote, survival was a significant theme in the games reviewed. Many games, 14%, required players to survive passage through dangerous areas, the onslaught of enemies, or even, in the case of one game, quote, the horrors within, end quote, end quote. The Last of Us Part 2 is a Naughty Dog game sequel to the first installment of the game, The Last of Us. The game is an action survival game with strong horror elements and themes. This is, like most action games and survival games, a game targeted at a male audience and fans of the first game. The aesthetics of the game are strongly influenced by the apocalyptic setting and the high-fidelity graphics. This game is very pretty, and therefore characters, environments, and enemies feel shockingly real. The two playable characters in this game are Ellie, a main character from the first game, and Abby, who is new to the story. Both of these young women, throughout the ending of the first game to the beginning of the second, are hit with major losses of father figures due to another person's violence. This leaves both women with unresolved trauma and guilt, as seen in the repeated cuts to nightmare scenes that echo each other just like the women's stories do. They are also left with anger about their respective losses. It leads both women to commit further violence because of the outcomes of the violence suffered by people important to them. This is similar to Joel, the other main character in the first installment of the game, who loses his daughter from senseless violence. Throughout the course of the game, he becomes attached to Ellie as a surrogate or second daughter. When the climax of the story unfolds, Joel commits countless acts of violence to save her and unknowingly puts his future down a different path. The lesson of this game is that this kind of violence is cyclical, as it takes Ellie down a dark path that leads her to become completely alone in a post-apocalyptic reality. While Ellie falls to revenge, Abby goes down a path of redemption. As players, they feel justified in committing the same acts as Ellie, like Joel did in the first game, but fail to see that Abby was just doing the same thing within her experience. Bethesda Softworks' second installment of the game, The Evil Within, shares many of the same horror elements and visual aesthetics of the first game, along with the classic horror genre gore and violence. This is a target audience of men mainly, but mostly people interested in the original game and people new to the genre. This installment has the same main character, but also includes characters that were only mentions in the first game. For example, the protagonist Sebastian's wife, Myra. The Evil Within 2 has Sebastian on a mission to rescue his young daughter Lily, who was previously thought to be dead, but has actually been connected to a digital mindscape system called STEM. On his journey, Sebastian runs into Myra, who was thought to be missing since the first game. When she and Sebastian reunite, she is actually hostile towards him, insisting that she must protect her daughter despite Sebastian not wanting to harm her. From character design to dialogue, it is all a display of Myra's strongest emotion taking over her in this mindscape reality, just as it has for other more psychopathic bosses in the game. Myra eventually becomes the final boss Sebastian must defeat. By choosing this, outside of the trope of killing who you love to save something, the writers put Myra on the same level as literal murderous psychopaths who tried to take Lily and use her, because supposedly her emotions drove her to become so overprotective. Myra was simply doing anything to protect Lily, even though Sebastian is trying to rescue Lily from the same thing. In the end, Myra was turned into a boss the player has to fight because her mind and overprotectiveness seemingly warped her mind, perpetuating the idea that a woman's strong emotions, typically referred to as hysteria, is uncontrollable and wrong. Resident Evil is an ongoing horror survival experience series that began in 1996, made by the company Capcom. The target audience is made up of fans of the series and newer fans of more modern horror games. Knowing this allows us to understand that the target audience is mostly male and that the violence and gore are selling points for the game. Considering this, the violent aesthetic of the game allows for the player to be as violent as the story calls for the sake of beating or surviving the game. The general look and feel of the game is desaturated and grim, which adds to the horror aesthetic. The eighth game in the series, Resident Evil Village, is about a father trying to rescue his infant daughter while having to fight all kinds of monstrosities. The character Ethan does whatever he has to do to defeat these creatures and collect all the pieces of his daughter. The overarching villain and final boss is Mother Miranda's main motivation is to use Ethan's daughter Rose to resurrect her own daughter who died a century ago. Everything she has done to get her daughter back is seen as evil. While I'll say the human experimentation is not the best defense, she is still harming people to get her child back. This harm is the same thing the player and Ethan is doing. One is seen as evil and the other is justified. Miranda's mental state is called out in-game as, quote, crazy and even as, quote, fucking insane. According to the Institute of Medicine U.S. Committee on Palliative and End-of-Life Care for Children and Their Families, quote, as with many losses, depressed feelings are accompanied by intense feelings of sadness, despair, helplessness, loneliness, abandonment, and a wish to die, end quote. Parents also have, quote, extreme feelings of vulnerability, anxiety, panic, and hypervigilance that can also accompany the sadness and despair, end quote. Also, Dorothy Bruton of the Journal of the American Association of Nurse Practitioners wrote that the, quote, loss of an infant child is a significant stressor on parents with documented negative physical and mental outcomes, end quote. Miranda's insanity comes from the despair-fueled obsession to be reunited with her daughter. This double standard between her deadly actions and Ethan's is unfair, and this game also perpetuates the idea that a woman's mental health, like strong grief, makes them a threat. Doki Doki Literature Club, a visual novel, is a psychological horror-style indie game about mental health with an all-female cast with the exception of the player's character, which is only implied as the typical target audience for a dating sim game like this is male. The goal is to get to know the characters and decide on which one to become a romantic partner with, depending on how far the game takes things. Mental health conditions in the main characters are severe and revealed throughout the player's progression, but are often driven to the extreme. Sayori is always cheerful, yet has severe depression, but depending on who the player chooses to become closer with, Sayori can be found after hanging herself in her bedroom. Another character, Natsuki, is supposedly a tsundere character type in that she is mean at first but will warm up to you if shown affection. Natsuki is, through storytelling, revealed to be abused by her father and starved as well. This is shown in a scene by her passing out during the club's meeting and another character, Monica, blatantly mentioning that she is malnourished. The fourth and final character, Yuri, has obsessive problems that lead her to cut herself by the prospect of winning the player character's approval. This is similar to a yandere character type, one who can cause harm to oneself or others if given the right motivation. Monica, however, is the outlier from the rest of the characters as she lingers in the background of the story, driving the other girls to their breaking points to also win the affection of the player. Her motivation being the same, but her methods are manipulative. Male approval becomes a literal life or death situation for these young girls. This is an obvious example of the girls placing their self-worth equivalent or less than to the desire to be admired by a male figure. They are defined by this approval, which neatly fills certain traditional female gender roles. Another game called Yandere Simulator is a psychological simulator game in a similar vein as Doki Doki Literature Club. An indie developer made this game for an audience of people, mainly male, who enjoy and even fetishize Japanese girls. The aesthetics are based on Japanese schoolgirl tropes. The bright colors and art style lend themselves to the style of many anime, including genres that are aimed at girls of a similar age to the schoolgirls in the stories and games. This is a game where your goal is to win the affection of your chosen classmate by any means necessary. In the game, you have a reputation that can be impacted by actions like taking pictures of unsuspecting female peers' underwear at school, or even murdering a female who seems to be getting too close to the player's chosen classmate. This game not only explores low self-worth, psychosis, and obsessive behavior, but it also keeps the trope of love-struck girls will do anything to gain the attention of someone, especially a male. That puts the girl's self-worth equal to the admiration she gets from a male peer. Women's mental health is not a fleshed out topic in games, mainly because neither women's traditional gender roles nor mental health are represented in an accurate to life way in most media and definitely not games today. In my examples, women that are allowed to have mental health issues in video games often come in a few forms. The first from moments of violence that lead them to committing further violence. Second, when it comes to a mother's mental health, they are portrayed as overbearing, obsessed, and almost hysterical. Thirdly, when Japanese culture is mixed with Western culture, this leads to stories about young high school-aged girls with severe mental illnesses acting out because they want the admiration of a male figure, typically the player. Another stark issue within these games in particular is that when men commit violence or fall down a morally, quote, bad path, it is excused for the sake of their journey and their story. As soon as female characters do it, there is immediately something wrong with her psyche. Video games have a very long way to go, as much as other media, in terms of accurately and fairly proportioning traditional gender roles and mental health topics.